Hello, I'm Dr. Lisa Colledge. Welcome to Culture by Neurodesign, the podcast where we explore how to design neuro-inspired teams that don't just survive change, but outpace, outperform, and outlast it. And today I'm going to explore a story that brings together three big themes: Silicon Valley, autism, and neuro-inclusive design. And this episode is for you if you're building technological capability, if you're working with AI, or if you're simply trying to make your team more effective. And the approach that I'm going to take is to look at a real world example, a well-documented and well-established example of how a culture can emerge that not only tolerates autistic minds, not only includes them, but enables them to lead with their strengths. And the example lets us see really clearly what happens when a culture meets people where they are and not where we think they should be. Now, let me set the stage by reminding us of a seemingly impossible task. We know that technology isn't a self-contained industry. More than ever before, it's embedded in some way in every job, every company, every sector, and especially now with the explosion of AI, the demand for skills in technology is skyrocketing. An expert just told me that there are 250 million companies looking to implement AI and only about 34,000 certified AI consultants. So where are we going to find the minds that are really comfortable working with large language models and training AI systems and spotting patterns and building structured logical workflows? Not only comfortable doing the work, but reliably strong at deriving benefits from it for our businesses. Now, a really good way to find answers to questions like these is to look at what's already been successful. The common phrase is to stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before, and to build on that. So ideally what we want to do is to find a population that has solved this problem already, copy what we can from it, and apply our energy to making improvements, not rediscovering what's already known. And there is a real life example of where people who are exceptionally capable at these kinds of skills have already congregated: Silicon Valley. So what can we learn from Silicon Valley that we can apply at scale to all of these 250 million companies who want to benefit from the potential offered by AI? What are the characteristics of this culture? And there's a great description of this culture from an article published back in 2001 by journalist Steve Silberman, who wrote a feature in Wired magazine called The Geek Syndrome. I think it's fair to call it a classic now. He was talking about Silicon Valley, and the reason for his interest in his research was something that many local educators, employers, providers of developmental services, and researchers in California, Santa Clara County had already noticed: an unusually high concentration of autistic children and adults in Silicon Valley. Now, at that time, there was still a lot of focus on the cause of autism and on finding a cure. And some of the language and concepts that Silberman uses in this article are out of date. The article's over 20 years old, and yeah, the language reflects its time. It talks about miswired nervous systems. It uses a distinction between high functioning and low functioning, or Asperger's and classic autism respectively, which isn't recommended anymore by the American Psychological Association. And he references the idea of a cure. But let's look past the words. A great tip when working with people who are different from us, neurodivergent, or from a different national background, or different in whatever way, is to focus on the meaning behind the words. So let's do that. The Silberman reported that the rate of growth of autism cases recorded in Santa Clara, where Silicon Valley is situated, was specific. There was an increase across all 4 counties served by same developmental services department, but Santa Clara, the heart of the tech world, had a strikingly higher percentage of autism diagnoses and also a higher growth rate. And when he researched why this was, Silberman discovered that the work in Silicon Valley was a natural fit for the skills and working preferences of autistic people. And because of the high concentration of autists that were attracted there, they had created an environment that naturally suited them. It wasn't an environment that was designed to be inclusive of autists, but it became that way because it was co-created by the people who were naturals with technology. and who also tended to be autistic and who showed up and built lives there. At this point, I want to emphasize something that's really critical to the approach to team performance that I advocate. And I think this was radical when Silberman wrote this article, especially because it was an opinion motivated by a group of people who were widely perceived to need curing at that time. In his article, he brought to life a culture that works because it meets people where they are, not where somebody else wants them to be. And it wasn't a charity model, it wasn't an accommodation model, it was a performance model. Silberman opened the article by introducing Nick. Nick's an 11-year-old boy building a vast science fiction universe on his computer. It included an anvil-shaped planet. How many 11-year-olds know what an anvil is? And it included gods, gnomes, and a 3-gendered race called the Kiman. And Nick was considering using quantum physics as a basis for magic in that world, as though that was a regular approach of how you would design magic in your science fiction world. Silberman describes him as a kind of Oxford Don, reincarnated in a tech-loving child. And Nick was illustrative. He wasn't an outlier. Silberman used him to illustrate a broader trend that he called the Geek Syndrome. And what he was really documenting was the emergence of a culture that worked because it fit a group of people who shared a lot of characteristics, autistic characteristics. So what does that culture look like? Well, it's not just a culture that autistic people were allowed to participate in. It's one that they helped to create. It's a culture that suited them, not just ethically, but strategically. And it obviously worked because Silicon Valley has been somewhat successful. As you might expect, it reflects the strengths of autists and it minimizes the situations where they struggle. It is a place where the amount of face-to-face social communication was really reduced. Right? The email and the screens, they created a layer of protection, a kind of a buffer from the sensory and social overload of a busy office. We don't even think about that nowadays because we all have screens and we use email every day, but it wasn't true everywhere by any means when this article was written. I remember in 2001 that the 8 or 10 people in the lab that I worked in shared 2 PCs. And I remember being very proud of my laptop and how I could unplug my land phone and connect it to the internet via a modem that went like Terminator 3. Silberman also describes the flattened hierarchies of Silicon Valley, which reduce the amount of subtle social signals to be interpreted, and it freed up mental space to focus on coding. And this environment that I'm describing was one where rules and systems were clearer. The only thing that mattered was writing bulletproof code, and the value of the work produced was measured by its clarity and accuracy, not by how charmingly or persuasively you presented it in a meeting. There's a quote in the article that I think is just wonderful. Clumsy and easily overwhelmed in the physical world, autistic minds soar in the virtual realms of mathematics, symbols, and code. End of quote. Autistic people thrive when they have order, precision, and depth, and they are qualities that align remarkably well with the demands of tech innovation. These cognitive preferences support the kind of sustained focus, structured problem solving, and system level thinking that drive high performance in technology-focused environments. They value clarity, logic, and well-structured systems, and these happen to be the backbone of Silicon Valley's innovation, and that's why there's such a natural concentration of autistic minds there. And Silicon Valley was even described by Silberman as a kind of science fiction paradise for autistic minds because it combined technology, systems, and imagination in just the right mix. So that's the end of Steve Silberman's story, but what is the moral of the story for this podcast? And while it might have started out as a local phenomenon in Silicon Valley, the ripple effects are global, especially now. Right? More of us are working remotely. More of our communication is screen-based. More organizations are moving towards asynchronous workflows and tech-centric collaboration. And without even realizing it, most of us have naturally adopted elements of that Silicon Valley culture that autistic people helped to pioneer. Tech is rippling out from Silicon Valley. I remember there are 250 million companies looking to implement AI that I mentioned earlier. So tech is rippling out, and we're all obviously going to be more successful in reaping those tech rewards if we copy elements of that culture that enabled people who are naturals at extracting the benefits from tech, so they can repeat the same magic outside Silicon Valley. So what if we did it on purpose? What if we stopped waiting for people to disclose their autism diagnosis before we made space for their working preferences? What if we created the conditions to ensure that autistic traits, those traits that we sometimes see as liabilities, to ensure that they can become assets? Here's another quote from the article that is well worth thinking about. It's a quote from Dan Geschwind, who was then director of the neurogenetics lab at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. And he said, certain kinds of excellence might require not just various modes of thinking, but different kinds of brains. End of quote. And that means that the real magic happens when you combine minds that are wired differently. I talked about this in some depth in episode 15 of this podcast, when I focused on the non-autistic Professor Laurent Motron and the complementary style of his autistic lab assistant, Michelle Dawson. So they valued each other's different approaches and they learnt how to work together, so their differences didn't create friction, as they so often do. They created momentum, innovative ideas, and scientific rigor. So if you're building your AI capability, if you're scaling a tech team, if you're simply trying to future-proof your workplace, then it's worth taking a look at what Silicon Valley's Geek Syndrome teaches us. And not every company is in Santa Clara County or needs to be, but every company can learn from it. And the lesson is design for different kinds of brains. We know that they are out there. They are almost certainly already working in your organization, whether you know it or not. And that's something to feel really optimistic about. The potential is already there in your organization. All we need to do is unlock it. So don't wait for someone to put up their hand and say they're autistic and require help using your compliant process. Instead, anticipate the difference and design your culture to be welcoming and enabling of autistic talent. Remember that difference. When you enable it, will deliver for you. Now, if this resonated, please also tell a friend or colleague who you think will be interested. And thanks for listening.